The cypress trees bent toward the house, as though listening to its hunger. Every plank of its walls seemed to pulse with secrets never spoken aloud. It was not built so much as it was summoned. That is what the old folks whispered, when the dusk turned violet and the crickets went mute all at once. The manor rose from the swamp like a carcass half drowned in mud, its foundations slick with roots that curled like blackened veins. Sem said the bricks had been fired not from clay, but from the marrow of bones left to bleach beneath the sun. Others swore the mortar was thickened with blood, mixed under a moonless sky by hands too thin and trembling to belong to the living. No map bore its name, yet all the fields and plantations around it bent in invisible orbit to its shadow. The house was not the grandest, not the widest, not the most adorned, but it breathed. Its shutters shuddered without wind. Its doors inhaled as though each lock and hinge were lungs straining for air. And the walls. God help those who leaned close enough. They said the walls carried a pulse, faint but steady, like a dying heart refusing to cease. "Don't look at it too long," the field hands whispered, their voices trembling as they glanced over their shoulders. "It sees when you see it. It hears when you call it cursed." Children were forbidden to point. Mothers slapped their hands down and made the sign of the cross, for pointing was invitation, and invitation was surrender. No man wished to surrender his child to that house. By day it appeared drowsy, as though slumbering in the heat, vines crawling over its chimneys like strangling fingers. But at dusk, when the swamp light turned gold and then bruised, the house lifted its head. Its windows glowed before candles were ever struck inside. Its doors swelled with the sound of wood groaning, as though shifting under unseen weight. Those who labored in its fields claimed they felt its hunger stretch outward, like the shadow of a vulture circling. The master of the house, Elijah Vey, was a man whose cruelty was sung about in broken hymns. But the elders whispered that it was not he who ruled, nor even his whip, but the house itself. Vey was its mouthpiece, its walking limb, the body that fed its appetite with flesh and terror. For the slaves there was no boundary between the man and the manor. Both drank their blood. Both gnashed their bones. Both left scars that never healed. Yet it was the kitchen, they said, where the heart of the house beat strongest. Stone walls slick with damp, a hearth that never cooled, as though coal smoldered in secret even when the fire was ash. Servants spoke of voices beneath the flagstones, soft murmuring like prayers whispered backward. At first they ignored them. At first they told themselves it was merely the settling of stone. But soon the murmurs began to answer questions no one had spoken aloud. One woman swore she heard her dead child call to her through the cracks in the hearth. Another claimed the stone floor told her when her master would strike next. And one, silent-eyed, pale as midnight fog, said nothing at all. But she listened more closely than anyone. The slaves named her Miriam. Her tongue, some said, had been stolen long ago, either cut from her mouth or bargained away in a pact made beneath the dripping moss. She never sang the sorrow songs. She never cried aloud, not even under the whip. Her silence was heavier than wailing, heavier even than chains, and it was Miriam who stayed longest in the kitchen, long after the others fled the hearth's whispering breath. She alone pressed her ear to the floor. She alone placed her hands upon the sweating stones and let their heat sink into her skin. What she heard there no one knew, but her eyes grew darker, deeper, like two wells that had no bottom. And when the master's shadow fell across the threshold, her gaze did not lower. The house watched her too. The shutters leaned toward her as she passed. The doorframes quivered when her fingers brushed them. The floorboards, thick with centuries of sealed cries, throbbed faintly beneath her bare feet. The house recognized its own, yet not all dared to believe such tales. Preachers rode past the swamp road and called it superstition, a devil's trick to keep men from God's light. But when night fell and the frogs ceased their singing, and the crows gathered black and heavy upon the gates, even the preachers' horses refused to ride forward. And so the house remained, a blister of rot upon the land, its hunger never quenched, its silence never broken, save by the faintest sounds of breath, of weeping, of something shifting in the rafters where no man walked. It was said that every lash of the whip, every chain that closed, every body dragged screaming down its halls fed it. Each cruelty swelled its walls. Each cruelty gave it pulse. And one night the cypress trees leaned so far they nearly snapped, the manor groaned so loud, the swamp itself fell silent. Something beneath the floor stirred. Something behind the walls began to beat, slow, deliberate, wet with the sound of flesh. The servants pressed themselves against their pallets and prayed, lips bleeding from biting them shut. The children covered their ears, though it did no good. The sound was not one you heard with ears, but one that struck bone, marrow, soul. Miriam did not pray. She sat at the hearth, her hand flat upon the sweating stone, her eyes unblinking as the walls trembled around her. When the beat stopped, when silence fell again, the cypress trees straightened. The swamp breathed once more, but Miriam smiled, and in the rafters something unseen whispered her name. By day the air split with the crack of leather. By night the sound still echoed, though no hand raised it. The whip was never still in Elijah Vay's hand. It was as though it had grown into his flesh, not an instrument of punishment, but an extra limb, sinewed and alive. The slaves said it had its own hunger, that even when coiled it whispered to itself, twitching like a serpent in dream. No hour of daylight was free from its bite. It lashed the air before breakfast, striking the backs of men whose only crime was breathing too slow. It lashed in the heat of noon, when sweat poured into open wounds and flies licked the blood. It lashed again at dusk, when shadows lengthened across the fields, as though it could drive back the night itself. Yet the cruelty of the whip was not only in its crack, but in its silence. For after dark, when Vay staggered into his cups and fell into heavy sleep, the whip did not rest. In the stillness of midnight its sound returned, sharp, slicing, cruel. No hand lifted it. No man dared step into the yard to see, but the sound of leather split the night all the same, echoing off the walls, tearing through dreams, reminding each soul that even rest was forbidden. Children covered their ears and whispered, "It's the house. It remembers." Some swore they saw shadows on the walls, shapes of men bending forward, jerking with each blow, though no bodies stood there. Others said the marks appeared on flesh come morning, stripes across backs and arms that no hand had struck. The whip did not sleep because the house itself did not sleep. Elijah Vay believed himself master of all things beneath his roof. Yet in quiet moments, when his own breath came ragged, when drink made him stumble into the dark corners of his house, he too heard it. The whip striking the silence. Louder when no eyes were upon him, louder when he tried to laugh it away. Sometimes he swore he caught a flicker at the edge of the candle flame, a woman's silhouette, head bowed, her back striped in blood. When he turned, there was nothing but shadow. But the crack followed him, no matter how deep he hid within his chambers. The slaves said it was Miriam who drew the sound closer, Miriam who fed the echo with her silence. She never flinched when the whip fell, never cried aloud though skin split and bone throbbed. The master grew furious at her quiet, for to him silence was defiance, and so he struck her harder, longer, until sweat slicked his brow and his hand cramped with effort. But Miriam never broke. She watched him through lashes heavy with blood, her mouth unmoving, her gaze unshaken. The house approved. There was a night in July when the heat was so thick it clung to the skin like tar. The cicadas had gone still, the swamp air heavy as if the sky itself had drowned. The slaves lay restless, pressing damp cloths against their foreheads when the whip cracked louder than it had ever cracked before. It did not come once. It came again and again, rhythm steady, merciless. The air shuddered with it, as though the sky split each time. Children screamed into their mothers' laps, the sound vibrating in their ribs. Men clamped hands to their ears, but the noise struck through bone. Someone whispered, "He's gone mad, he's whipping shadows." But when they risked peering through the shutters of their quarters, they saw no figure in the yard. The post where men were tied was empty. The moon glared down on nothing but trampled dirt. Yet the whip sang on. And then came the strangest sight of all. The earth itself moved. With each lash, dust rose in long, thin lines, as though the ground bore the stripes of its punishment. The whip was carving the soil. The slaves dropped to their knees and begged the Lord to still it. But the sound rose higher, sharper, like laughter cleaved into leather, and then silence. When morning came, they saw the ground outside striped black, each mark sunk deep as if cut with a knife. But no blade could have moved so straight, so endless. It was the house that had taken the whip into itself. Elijah Vay stumbled from his chambers that dawn, his eyes bloodshot, his hand trembling. The whip coiled at his belt was damp, though he had not touched it. His face blanched as he stared at the marks carved into the earth. For the first time he did not laugh, did not curse, did not strike. He only looked toward the house, as though seeking an answer in its windows. The house gave him none. But Miriam, standing in the shadow of the kitchen door, watched him long and slow. Her eyes glimmered not with fear, but with a patience so deep it made his knees weak, and when he turned away, when he forced himself to walk, he thought he heard the sound of the whip crack just behind his ear, though it never touched him. That night, when the house sank into silence, a new noise came, faint, distant but steady. The sound of weeping, not of the living, but of the dead. And on the wall of the dining room, beneath the mounted deer heads and trophies of the hunt, a new mark appeared, a single black stripe, stretching from ceiling to floor, as though the house itself had been lashed. She moved like a shadow at the edge of the firelight. Her silence was not submission, but a prayer the devil had already answered. They said Miriam had once been a singer, that her voice had carried over the fields like a hymn torn from heaven's own throat. Old hands remembered nights when her song stitched the broken, when its sorrow wound through the chains and made them feel, if only for a breath, unshackled. But one summer, her voice was gone. Some whispered Elijah Vay had cut it from her mouth himself, tired of hearing a song that did not praise him. Others believed she had offered it freely, kneeling at the kitchen hearth, trading her voice to the dark that lived beneath the stones. For silence, after all, is not always weakness. Sometimes it is covenant. No one dared ask Miriam the truth. She would not have answered. Her silence became her shape. She drifted through the manor, as though she had always belonged to its shadow. Bare feet upon the boards, eyes cast not to the floor in shame, but straight ahead, watching, always watching. And when the others wailed beneath the whip, when their cries rose into the rafters, Miriam's gaze alone did not falter. She carried her pain inward, folding it into her silence until it became something else entirely, something heavier than grief, sharper than rage. Her silence was a weapon. Elijah Vay despised her quiet more than he despised screams. He struck her longer, deeper, until sweat darkened his shirt, yet she never cried out. She bled but made no sound, and in her stillness he saw himself undone. "You think you're above me," he hissed once, breath hot with rum. The lash left her back wet and raw, yet her eyes never lowered. They reflected his face as though in dark glass, distorted, hollow. He stumbled from her, whip trembling in his hand. He did not know why the sight of her silence shook him more than 100 curses could, but the house knew. In the kitchen, the hearth whispered louder when Miriam entered. The others avoided the stones, crossing themselves as they hurried past. But Miriam pressed her hand to the sweat-slick floor. She leaned close until the heat reddened her cheek. The murmurs swelled. They spoke in tongues no one should know. They named things buried in shallow graves. They called her by name, though no mouth formed the sound. Her eyes darkened as she listened, and though her lips never moved, something in her breath changed. It no longer rose and fell with the rhythm of the living, but matched instead the slow, dragging pulse that throbbed in the manor walls, and sometimes, late at night, when the others stirred from restless sleep, they swore they saw Miriam moving through the corridors where no one dared walk. She carried no candle, yet her figure glowed faintly, as if the walls themselves lent her their light. One night, as rain lashed against the cypress trees, a young boy, the cook's son, spoke to her. His voice was small, his eyes wide with terror, for he had heard the whip crack in his dreams. "Miriam," he whispered, clutching her sleeve, "why don't you scream? Don't you want heaven to hear?" She looked down at him, her face carved in shadow. For a long moment the boy thought she would not answer, and then she bent low, lips close to his ear. Her voice was no louder than a breath, but it was real. "Heaven ain't listening." The boy's skin prickled, his heart rattling like a snared bird. He wanted to ask where she had learned to speak again, but he could not, for her lips had already closed and her silence fell heavier than before. The others began to notice changes. Food left in the pantry spoiled faster when Miriam passed. Milk curdled, bread soured. The fire bent away from her shadow, as if it feared to touch her. Even the hounds at the gate, vicious beasts trained to tear flesh from bone, lowered their heads when she walked near. They whimpered as though in submission. The master called it witchcraft. He spat and raised his whip, swearing he would beat the devil from her bones. Yet when the lash fell, the sound echoed louder than it should have, as though the house itself joined in. And in the pause between strikes, Elijah Vay thought, though he dared not admit it, that he heard another sound entirely, Laughter, not from Miriam's lips, not from any throat, but from the beams overhead, from the walls, from the hollow belly of the hearth, a low, scraping laughter that thickened the air like smoke. From that night on, Vey never beat Miriam alone. He always made the others watch, as though their presence could drown out the dread her silence stirred in him. Yet even with a dozen eyes upon her, even with blood streaming down her back, Miriam's gaze remained fixed, unyielding, endless. Her silence no longer felt like absence. It felt like prophecy. The slaves began to speak her name only in whispers, never after dark. Some said she was no longer entirely of this world, that her silence was the language of the house itself, and that in listening to the hearth she had become its chosen voice. Yet a voice without sound is a terror deeper than words. On a sweltering night in August, when the air itself seemed to rot, Miriam stood alone in the kitchen. The others lay restless, praying for dawn, but she did not sleep. The hearth glowed though no fire burned. Shadows swayed across the walls as if stirred by unseen hands. Miriam lifted her head slowly, her eyes reflecting the dark red glow, and though her lips did not part, the house itself spoke. Every board groaned at once, every window shuddered. The rafters moaned like throats dragged across stone. The sound rose and fell with the rhythm of breath, her breath, though no sound left her chest. The house had learned her silence. By morning, the slaves found black handprints smeared along the walls of their quarters. Not theirs, not the master's. Prints too long, too thin, burned into the wood as though seared by fire. And standing in the doorway, bathed in pale light, Miriam watched them with eyes that seemed older than the swamp itself. She did not smile. She did not speak. But the silence that followed was so heavy it bent the room, pressing their lungs flat, sealing every prayer in their throats. The stones sweated with a heat that was not from the fire. Some swore they heard voices bubbling up through the ashes. The kitchen was the belly of the house, and the hearth was its mouth. Every meal began there, every hunger ended there. Pots boiled, knives sang against the boards, smoke clung to the beams like old grief. But beneath all this, beneath the scraping, the stirring, the endless labor, there was another sound, a whisper. At first it came faint, like the hiss of steam escaping through cracks in the brick. The slaves ignored it, pressing harder into their work. They told themselves it was the wind slipping between stones, the groan of wood settling, the mutter of flames. They told themselves many things, anything but the truth, for the whispers were not the language of air or fire. They carried shape, names, pleas. They bubbled up in fragments like bones surfacing through shallow soil. Don't bury me. The blood won't wash. Take it back, take it back. The longer one listened, the clearer the words became, until at last they pressed sharp and undeniable against the ear, a voice not outside but within. The hearth was speaking. None lingered near it, longer than necessity demanded. They stirred pots from as far away as arms could stretch, eyes averted, lips moving in frantic prayer. The youngest children covered their ears when sent near the fire, for they swore it called their names. But Miriam, silent Miriam, did not turn away. She lingered after the others fled. She pressed her palm flat against the sweating stone. The heat burned her flesh, yet she did not recoil. She bent low, her cheek nearly touching the ash, and listened. The whispers quickened when she came. No longer broken words, but sentences that rolled like a tongue grown bold. Their voices were layered, men, women, children, all woven into one unholy chorus. The others would not approach, but they watched from the doorway, clutching their arms as goose flesh crept up their skin. They saw Miriam tilt her head as though nodding, as though agreeing with whatever horror crawled through the cracks. Sometimes they swore her lips moved, though no sound left her mouth. She was answering. One night, when rain gnawed at the shutters and the swamp croaked restless, a boy crept from his pallet, drawn by curiosity sharper than fear. He peered into the kitchen and saw Miriam kneeling before the hearth. The fire was cold, yet the stones glowed as though lit from within. Her shadow stretched across the walls, too long, too many-limbed, as though the house itself borrowed her shape. The boy pressed his hand to his mouth, holding back a cry. And in that moment Miriam turned. Her eyes caught his like hooks. She raised one finger to her lips, bidding silence, though she had no need. Her silence was already a shroud. Then she pointed to the hearth, and the boy heard it too, not the vague murmur the others described, but his mother's voice. She had been dead 3 years, buried in the swamp's edge after fever took her. Yet here she was, whispering his name, begging him to come closer. He staggered backward, stumbling into the hall, heart thundering so loud he thought it would wake the master. He did not return to the kitchen for weeks, though her voice haunted him from the ashes every time the fire was stoked. The whispers spread like sickness. Men dreamed of their fathers calling from the hearth, their voices warped, begging for water, for forgiveness, for blood. Women woke trembling, certain they had heard their lost children scratching at the stones. One by one they broke. Some pressed their ears to the bricks until skin blistered. Others tried to dig at the hearth with spoons, knives, bare hands, desperate to reach the voices below. None succeeded. The stones only grew hotter, as though the house laughed at their suffering. And Miriam grew stronger. She no longer bent in labor. Her back straightened, her steps slowed, deliberate. The air around her thickened, and wherever she stood, silence fell. Not the silence of peace, but of listening, the master noticed. He spat at her feet, accused her of witchery, swore the devil had planted her in his house. But even he, in drunken stupor, avoided the hearth. He had once leaned too close, and for days afterward, he swore he heard his own name murmured through the crackling ash. Not in pleading, not in prayer, but in hunger. The house did not forget, the house never forgot, and the hearth was its tongue. There came a night when the whispers rose to screams. The stones rattled in their sockets, ash flurried like black snow. The servants huddled in the corner, arms around each other, as the hearth bellowed with the voices of the dead. Miriam stood apart, unmoving. Her hand pressed flat to the stone, her face bathed in the glow. Her eyes closed as if in ecstasy. The voices clawed the air. "We are still here. We are beneath you. Feed us." And when they fell silent at last, the kitchen was colder than a grave. The next morning a mark had appeared above the hearth, blackened, charred into the brick itself. It was the outline of a hand, too long, too thin, its fingers stretched toward the ceiling. The others turned their faces away, but Miriam stared at it until her lips curved in the faintest suggestion of a smile. That evening, when the fire was lit, the flames bent outward, not upward. They curled away from the hearth as if repelled, as if unwilling to touch what dwelled there. And in the dark, as the servants lay sleepless, the stones whispered louder still, but this time, the voices did not call for water, they called for blood. The dining room glowed with candlelight, yet the flames bent away from the table. Something in the air tasted of rust and grave soil. The dining room of the Vey Manor was not built for comfort, but for spectacle. Long and narrow, its walls were lined with mounted trophies, antlers that branched like blackened roots, skulls yellowed with age, and glass eyes that glimmered like wet stones. The table stretched nearly the length of the hall, so heavy it seemed a ship's keel laid upon the floor. Silverware gleamed, though never polished by willing hands. The plates were white, rimmed with gold leaf, delicate things too fine for the hunger they served, but it was not the food that held power there. Not the venison roasted, not the hens spitted, not the bread dark with molasses. It was the air. The air always carried a taste of iron, not the faint tang of cutlery nor the bite of spilled wine, but the unmistakable weight of blood. Thick, metallic, unclean. No matter how the servants scrubbed the floor, no matter how they aired the curtains, it lingered. It clung to the back of the throat, coated the teeth, settled heavy in the lungs. Those who entered with empty stomachs soon felt sick. Those who entered full soon felt hungrier than they had ever been, as though the air itself gnawed their bellies from the inside. And always the candles bent. Their flames, though steady in every other chamber, leaned away from the table as though repelled by it. At times they stretched sideways, smoke slithering toward the ceiling in crooked lines. It was said the table was older than the house itself. That Elijah Vey's grandfather had brought it upriver from a ruin no one remembered, that the wood was cut from trees that never grew in this soil. Some whispered it had been feasted on before, in other halls by men who had long since rotted to dust. The table, they said, was already cursed when it was dragged across the swamp. The house had simply been built around it, like flesh growing around bone. Elijah Vey loved to eat there, not for hunger, but for dominion. He sat at the head, whip coiled beside his plate, his goblet always full. He made the slaves serve him, their hands trembling as they set dishes before him. He chewed slowly, loudly, his teeth gnashing flesh from bone. He delighted in leaving scraps for the hounds, tossing them beneath the table where their snarls echoed between the legs of the guests. But the house did not delight. The house remembered. Every cruelty, every lash, every prayer choked back beneath the whip seeped into its walls, and the dining room drank deepest of all. One night, during a storm that shook the shutters loose from their hinges, Elijah ordered a feast greater than any before. Candles lit the hall end to end, shadows quivering along the walls like figures pressed against them from the other side. Servants hurried back and forth, dishes trembling in their hands. The meat came heavy on the platters, steaming and red. The bread cracked beneath knives, though no yeast had risen it. Wine poured like black syrup, staining the lips of those forced to taste it before him. But when the dishes were laid upon the table, the air changed. The iron taste thickened until it seemed they were breathing rust. The servants gagged silently, eyes watering, yet none dared falter. The master raised his goblet sneering and took his first sip. The candles recoiled at once. Their flames bent sharply backward, straining as if to flee. One guttered out with a hiss, leaving smoke that curled into the shape of a hand before dispersing. Miriam stood at the far end of the room, silver tray in her hands. Her eyes never left the master. Her silence thickened the air until it pressed on the lungs of every soul present. They said later that the food turned black in the bowls. That bread crumbled into ash, meat bled raw though cooked, and wine thickened into something darker than any grape. The smell of soil rose from the table, grave soil, fresh turned, wet and heavy. The master laughed, swore the devil himself would eat at his table before he starved. He tore the meat with his teeth, chewed, swallowed. But as he did, the others swore they saw his lips darken, his tongue blacken. The veins in his temples pulsed, as though too much blood surged through them at once, and Miriam, silent, shadowed Miriam, did not move. She only lowered her tray slowly, her eyes like twin pools of tar. One servant, unable to bear it longer, glanced toward the hearth at the end of the hall. He thought he heard whispers rising even there, though no fire burned in that place. The voices seemed to crawl beneath the boards circling the table, climbing its legs. Eat, eat, eat. The voices grew until they filled the room, though the master laughed louder to drown them. He pounded his fist upon the table, rattling the goblets, scattering bones. But still the whispers pressed in, and then came a silence sharper than screams. Every candle died at once. The hall plunged into black. The servants froze, their breath caught. The hounds beneath the table whimpered, tails thumping as they crawled backward into the shadows. And in that silence, every plate upon the table shifted. Not by hand, not by gravity, but by will. The silver scraped the wood in unison, as though drawn across it by something unseen. Each plate slid closer to Elijah Vey, gathering before him like offerings at an altar. When the candles sputtered back to life, the servants gasped, for the plates no longer held meat or bread or fruit. They held bones, not deer, not cattle, not fowl, but human small bones, long bones, finger bones. They clattered faintly in the shallow bowls, pale against the dark wood. The master's goblet brimmed not with wine but with blood, dark and steaming. Its surface trembling as though stirred from beneath. The air choked them all, the taste of rust now unbearable, and Miriam at the far end of the room finally smiled. The next morning, when the storm had passed, the table was bare. No bones, no blood. Only the stain of black rings where the goblets had stood. But the smell remained, and those who dared breathe too deeply swore they tasted grave soil still, clinging to the back of their tongues like rot. They said the house wanted a sacrifice, and when it was not given, it chose its own. The silver tray had always glimmered in the Vey household, polished until it reflected the face of anyone who dared look into it. But in its depths the reflection did not remain faithful for long. Sometimes the eyes blinked when they should not. Sometimes the mouth moved though the lips above were still. And sometimes, if one stared too long, the reflection began to rot. The servants whispered that the tray was older than the master himself, that his mother had carried it into the swamp, covered in cloth, a wedding gift from a family who spoke too softly and smiled too seldom. It had served at every feast since, bearing roasted meats and sugared fruits passed from hand to hand like a relic. But relics remember, and silver tarnishes deepest where blood has touched. Miriam had carried it that night during the feast of ash and iron. Her thin hands balanced it as if it weighed nothing, though the hall seemed to tilt beneath its presence. She did not speak. She did not falter, She only lowered it onto the table, where it gleamed faintly in the bent light of the candles. The master did not notice then. He was too drunk on his own cruelty, too full of meat that blackened on his tongue. But the house noticed. The house always noticed. The tray waited. In the weeks that followed, the servants swore the tray grew heavier. What once needed one arm now required two. Dishes slid across it of their own accord, rattling faintly like teeth in a skull. One maid claimed she carried fruit upon it, only to find the grapes shriveled to flies when she set them down. Another swore she served water in goblets, but by the time they reached the master, the cups brimmed with something red and pulsing. The master struck them all, declaring them lazy, cursed liars. Yet even he began to avoid his own reflection in its surface. He covered it with cloth when not in use, as though veiling a corpse. Still it gleamed. Still it waited. One night, when the moon lay veiled in storm clouds and the swamp boiled with frogs, Elijah Vay called for a feast once more. He ordered the tray to be used. Miriam obeyed. She lifted the silver as if it had grown light again, light as a whisper, light as a sigh, and carried it to the table. The candles flickered. The hounds whimpered. The servants froze. Upon the tray lay not venison, not fowl, not bread, but a head. It was not fresh. Nor was it fully rotted. Its skin sagged like wax half melted, its eyes filmed over white. Yet its lips still moved faintly, as though struggling to form words lost to the grave. The smell that rose from it was not of death alone, but of damp soil, of chains rusted in the rain, of prayers smothered beneath earth. The servants gasped. One dropped to her knees, clutching her mouth. Another turned and fled, only to find the door would not open. The master rose slowly from his chair. His face hardened, yet his eyes widened with something close to fear. He demanded to know whose trick this was, whose treachery dared defile his hall. But Miriam said nothing. She only stood, her hand steady upon the edges of the tray. Her gaze fixed upon him as if she had carried this head for him alone. The master swore, spat, struck the tray with his fist. The sound rang like a church bell, hollow and dreadful, reverberating through the rafters until dust fell from the beams. The head rolled, and for the briefest moment, its milky eyes locked with his, and then it spoke. Its voice was not air but soil, not breath but rust. The words crumbled from its lips like stones rolling down a grave. Elijah. The master staggered backward, his goblet spilling black across the cloth. His lips moved, but no sound escaped. The room tightened, the air pressing heavy upon their lungs. The hounds beneath the table yelped once, then fell silent, tails limp. Again the head spoke. This time, the words were clearer. Your feast is not yet finished. The candles bent violently, all flames leaning toward the head upon the tray. Shadows pooled along the walls, gathering shape and weight. Servants collapsed, fainting, their bodies convulsing as if choked by invisible hands. The master tried to flee, but the table held him fast. His hands stuck to the wood, his flesh searing where it touched. He screamed, but the sound twisted into laughter, not his own. Miriam never moved, she only watched, and as the master writhed, the head upon the tray began to smile. Its lips peeled back, revealing teeth too sharp, too many. Its tongue unfurled, black and slick, tasting the air, and then slowly it began to rise, not lifted by hand, not by Miriam's strength, but by will. The head levitated above the tray, dripping grave soil onto the polished silver. Its jaw opened wider and wider, until the sound that poured forth was not voice, not laughter, but a shriek of iron and fire, like chains torn apart. The hall filled with the sound. The windows rattled. The walls groaned. The swamp outside fell silent, every creature listening, every tree bowing to its echo. The master's eyes bulged. His mouth opened in a scream that never came. His body convulsed, then went still, slumping forward across the table. When the sound finally ceased, only silence remained, and the head, now still, now rotted, lay once more upon the tray. By dawn, the master's corpse had blackened, veins swollen with something tar-like. The servants dared not touch him. The tray lay beside him, gleaming, empty, waiting. And Miriam, she was gone, her chamber was found bare. No clothes, no shoes, no trace. Only her shadow lingered upon the wall, faint as soot, stretched long as though she had walked out of the house and into the swamp itself. But the tray remained. always polished, always hungry, and when the next feast came, the servants swore they heard something breathing in its silver. The house had learned to eat. Not flesh, not bread, not the master's rotted feasts, but the voices of those who suffered within it. When Elijah Vay's body was dragged from the table, stiff and blackened, the house did not mourn. No bells tolled, no prayers rose. The cypress trees outside bent closer, their moss-draped arms brushing the windows, as though congratulating the mansion for a meal well taken. The servants whispered that the walls themselves seemed to thrum in the days that followed, as though sated with some unholy nourishment. And yet, hunger never truly sleeps. It waits. The hunger of that house was for sound. The first to notice was Dinah, the cook. She was alone in the kitchen when she burned her hand on the iron pot. Her scream leapt from her throat, bright with pain, but the sound never carried. It vanished before it touched the air, as though the very walls swallowed it whole. Her lips moved. Her lungs emptied, but the cry was gone. She trembled, staring at the hearthstones that sweated and hissed with unnatural heat. The kitchen was silent, though she knew she had screamed. Only the faintest echo lingered, caught not in the room, but in the floor beneath her feet, muffled, buried. She dared not speak of it aloud. Soon, others learned. A stable boy crushed his hand beneath the weight of a saddle. His cry vanished the moment it left him. He clutched his bleeding palm, but all that lingered was a faint groan inside the wooden beam beside him, as though the stable itself had spoken. A maid fell down the cellar stairs, bones cracking on the stone. Her scream dissolved, sucked into the damp walls, leaving her whimpers hollow, broken, unheard. The house was feeding. At night, when the wind pressed against the shutters, the servants huddled together, afraid to sleep alone. For now the walls began to give back what they had eaten. At first it was faint, like voices behind a door, but soon the boards groaned with words. Screams bled from the plaster, moans pulsed from the beams above. The very ceiling dripped with whispers, faint as breath against the ear. "Let us out." Not yet finished. Still burning, the servants covered their ears, but the sound pressed through skin and bone, feeding on their terror. Some swore they heard their own voices thrown back at them, cries they had made in pain, now mocked, replayed, stretched into eternity. One night, a thunderstorm broke above the swamp, and with it, the walls began to wail in full. The house shuddered, boards rattling as if clawed from within. Every scream it had eaten poured forth together, a chorus of agony that bent the air. The servants fell to their knees, clutching their heads as though the sound would split their skulls. Lightning flashed, and in its light, the walls seemed to ripple like flesh. Faces swelled in the wood grain, eyes bulging, mouths wide in silent horror. Some were familiar. The boy whipped to death in the field, the woman drowned in the marsh, the master's own twisted grin. Others were strangers, old and new, voices swallowed long before memory. The screams were endless, the house drank them in again, as though feasting upon its own echo, growing louder with each swallow. The servants begged the overseer to let them leave, but he, fearful of curses and bound by greed, forbade it. The field still needed tending, the estate still needed hands. He told them the sounds were nothing but swamp winds, that their minds were weak. But he too began to hear the voices. Late at night, in the room where Elijah Vay had once slept, he awoke to the walls calling his name. Not whispers, not groans, but clear, sharp syllables. Jonah. The sound was not his imagination. It was his own mother's voice, long dead. He pressed his ear to the paneling, heart pounding, and heard her weeping there. When he tore at the wood with his nails, desperate, he found nothing but dust. Still, the voice laughed softly after, echoing in the beams. By the harvest, the house was alive with cries. Every doorframe hummed with pain. Every staircase sighed with despair. The floors quivered beneath their weight, as though every plank bore chains unseen. The servants no longer screamed when hurt, for they knew the walls would only take it. They swallowed their cries, bit down on their tongues, stifled their grief. But silence too the house consumed, an absence of sound that it filled with its own whispers, and when silence was not enough, it demanded again. One night, Miriam returned, or so they thought, for as the house moaned and the beams split with shrieks, a figure stood in the hall, bare feet upon the boards, eyes dark as riverstone, her shadow stretching twice her height against the flickering walls. The servants gasped. some calling her name. But when she opened her mouth, no words came. Only the sound of every scream the house had swallowed poured forth from her throat, layered, endless, a torrent of agony that split the air like thunder. The walls shivered. The tray in the dining hall rattled, and every face pressed deeper into the wood, mouths opening wider. The house was no longer merely feeding, it was singing. By dawn, the hall was empty. The servants were gone. Some claimed they fled into the swamp, never to be seen. Others whispered they were taken into the walls themselves, voices stripped from their lungs, bound into the wood grain forever. Only one remained, the overseer Jonah, slumped at the master's old seat. His mouth hung open, yet no sound escaped, not even breath. The stain beneath his chair had deepened, black and wet, spreading outward like ink in the walls. They groaned with satisfaction, as though full from a harvest of souls. But hunger is never still for long. For 3 nights after, the crows began to gather. They sat upon the gate, tapping their beaks against the iron, tap, tap, tap. Each strike rang like a coffin nail. They came on wings blacker than tar, not 1 or 2, but dozens and then hundreds, until the sky itself seemed stitched together by feathers and shadow. The gate of the Vey plantation was wrought iron, high and cruel, sharpened into points that once kept men in as much as they kept beasts out. Rust clung to it like dried blood, yet it stood firm. The first and last barrier between the swamp and the house. It was to this gate that the crows came. The first was seen at dusk, perched atop the highest point. Its beak struck the metal once, sharp, deliberate. A sound too heavy for such a small body. By dawn there were a dozen. By noon 50. And by nightfall the iron bars shivered with the weight of them all. The servants who still lingered after the night of screams dared not pass beneath. They whispered from windows, trembling at the sight of so many eyes. For crows were no strangers in the South Carolina swamps, but these were not carrion feeders. They were watchers, judges, harbingers. Each beak tapped against the gate in rhythm. As though nailing shut a coffin, none dared open. Tap, tap, tap. The sound traveled through the iron and into the earth itself, thudding up through the floorboards of the house. The walls, once filled with voices, now fell silent to listen. On the second night, lightning split the swamp, and in its flash, the servants swore the crows moved as one. Hundreds of heads turned in unison, eyes gleaming white as bone. They were not looking outward toward the marsh. They were looking inward, toward the house. One boy, half mad with terror, fled to the gate to chase them off with a stone. He hurled it, and the rock struck true. The crow it hit tumbled lifeless to the ground, but when he bent to lift it, the bird's body burst into ash. Black dust scattered into the air, and from its plume rose a second crow, wings beating, eyes brighter, sharper, older. The boy did not scream. The house would only eat it. By dawn he was gone. On the third night the air thickened with the smell of rot. Not the rot of meat or swamp, but the rot of iron rusting in blood. The gate dripped, though no rain had fallen. Red streaks ran down its bars, staining the earth. The crows pecked at the iron as if sharpening their beaks, each strike ringing louder. The servants swore the sound echoed inside their skulls, rattling bone, loosening teeth. No one dared step outside, yet even inside. The sound followed, tap, tap, tap. Every heartbeat became a nail. The overseer Jonah, hollow-eyed and half-deaf from the house's screams, rose from the master's chair and staggered to the gate on the 4th night. His voice cracked as he shouted at the birds, demanding they leave, cursing them in words stolen from scripture and slave song alike. The crows only watched, their wings lifted once, a wave of shadow. And then they fell silent. The silence was worse than the tapping. Jonah pressed his forehead to the bars, his fists trembling against the bloodied iron. In the moonlight, his reflection looked not like his own, but Elijah Vey's, grinning, rotted, eyes alive with hunger. The crows saw too, and they laughed, not with sound but with movement, throats bobbing, wings twitching, beaks opening in silent mockery. The rhythm of their bodies was a language older than men, older than chains, older than the house itself. Jonah understood none of it, but the house did. By dawn, Jonah was gone as well. The servants found only his boots at the gate, filled not with feet but with feathers black as soot, no body, no bones, only feathers. The gate groaned as if with breath, and every crow turned its head toward the manor. The days that followed blurred into one another. The servants no longer knew if they were alive or ghosts themselves. They kept to corners, to shadows, refusing to speak lest the walls devour their words. The crows did not leave. For 3 nights they stayed, as though waiting for a feast yet to come. The tapping of their beaks against the iron became a heartbeat that guided the swamp. Frogs croaked in rhythm. Crickets fell silent to mark the pauses. Even the wind shifted in time, bending cypress boughs like bowed heads. The swamp itself was listening. On the 7th night, the feast arrived. The dining room was set, though no hands had touched it. Plates gleamed in rows. Goblets brimmed with black liquid. Candles burned, though no wick had been lit. At the table's head sat the silver tray, veiled with cloth, trembling faintly. The servants gathered at the edges of the hall, trembling, unable to flee, unable to look away. And from outside, through shuttered windows and closed doors, came the sound. Tap, tap, tap. The crows at the gate called for the lid to be lifted. The house quivered in reply. By midnight, the cloth was gone. What lay upon the tray that night no servant could name. Some swore it was the head again, though older now, the flesh dripping like candle wax. Others claimed it was Elijah himself, seated upright though bodiless, grinning with gums black as tar. Still others said it was nothing, only the silver. Yet in its surface they saw their own deaths reflected. Whatever it was, it breathed. And as it breathed, the crows beat their wings once, twice, thrice, in perfect rhythm with its pulse. The house had fed on screams. Now it would feed on silence. And the gate, crowned with crows, would not open again until the feast was finished. And so the stain grew darker in the master's seat, soaking deeper into the wood. A stain no scrubbing could lift, a stain that still breathes when the moon is full. No throne remains unmarked by the weight of cruelty. And the chair at the head of the vey table bore not just the master's shape, but his sin. The dining hall lingered in silence after the feast of the crows, the silver tray veiled once more, the goblets empty, the plates untouched. Yet at the table's head, Elijah Vey's seat endured, a high-backed oak chair carved with talons and vines, built not for comfort but dominion. The wood was dark to begin with, but now it drank deeper, its grain saturated with a stain that spread outward from where his body once slumped, black, thick, iridescent in the candlelight. No cloth concealed it, no hand dared scrub it. For each who tried soon learned that the stain was alive. The first to attempt cleansing was Dinah, the cook. She came with water and lye, scrubbing until her hands bled. The stain spread beneath her rag, climbing the legs of the chair like roots seeping across the floor. When she pulled away in horror, she found her palms darkened too, veins rising like ink beneath her skin. She burned the rag in the hearth, but the fire hissed, sputtered, and died. For 3 nights after, Dinah's hands shook. By the 4th she was gone, leaving behind only a single wooden spoon blackened at the handle, resting on the seat itself. The stain pulsed where it lay. Others tried, driven by fear. Soap and ash, holy water, even blood were offered to erase it. Each failed. Each offering the chair swallowed, feeding its hunger. The servants swore that when no one looked, the stain shifted. Sometimes it writhed like worms beneath the wood. Sometimes it swelled, a shadow bulging against the grain as if the chair itself were breathing. And sometimes, in the deepest hours of night, the chair groaned. Not the creak of timber, but the guttural moan of a throat still raw from screaming. It was the overseer Jonah's boots that first vanished into the stain, left at the gate after the crow's feast. Servants whispered the seat had claimed them. Indeed, when they crept near, they saw leather seams half sunk into the wood, as though absorbed into its body. Next it took the goblet Elijah had last held. One moment it gleamed upon the table. The next it had slid toward the stain, its rim trembling, its silver dissolving as it touched the mark. And soon whispers rose that it wanted more. Not objects, not offerings, but flesh. One boy, desperate to prove his courage, sat upon the chair at dawn. He declared he feared no curse, no stain, no memory of the dead master. For a moment, nothing happened. The servants gasped in relief. Then the boy screamed, but the house ate his cry before it left his mouth. His eyes widened. His fingers clawed the arms of the seat. The stain bled up his body like spilled ink. Swallowing his clothes, his skin, his face, in a breath, he was gone. Only the echo of his scream lingered in the walls, and the stain had deepened, gleaming wet as if freshly fed. After that, no one dared near it. The dining hall grew colder, fouler, yet the chair remained untouched at the head of the table, waiting. But though no one sat upon it, the seat was never empty. At dusk, shadows gathered in its shape. At midnight, Elijah's silhouette sometimes appeared, slumped, head tilted as though listening to voices none could hear. Some swore they saw his fingers drumming against the table, the sound muffled, as if coming from beneath the wood. Others claimed it was not Elijah at all, that the seat had become a throne for something older, darker, something that had lived in the tray, in the walls, in the crows. The stain was not the master's, it was the house's. The walls groaned more loudly each night, as if echoing the pulse of that stain. The windows rattled, the hearthstone cracked. Even the swamp itself seemed to lean closer, its waters darkening, its cypress roots reaching toward the house. The servants had dwindled. Some fled into the marsh. Some were taken by the walls. Some vanished without a sound, leaving only their shadows pressed into plaster. Those who remained gathered in silence, knowing what would come next, for the stain was not content to sit in wood. It spread. Across the floorboards, black veins crept like spilled ink. Across the table, patterns bloomed like mold. It reached the walls, the beams, the doors. Soon the whole house throbbed with it, and as it spread, the voices grew louder, not screams this time, but laughter, laughter layered upon laughter, rising, choking, endless. On the last night, as the moon bled red above the swamp, the stain swelled until it dripped from the chair, puddling on the floor like tar. It reflected nothing of the room, not the fire, not the faces of those who dared witness it, only the silver tray gleaming from afar, though it sat empty, untouched. The servants fell to their knees, their mouths moving, though no sound emerged. For the laughter filled the house, and within it was a promise. The stain was no longer just a mark. It was a mouth. And it was hungry still. By dawn the chair was empty once more, but no one remained to see it. Only the gate stood silent, the crows gone, the swamp quiet. And yet deep within the house the table remained. Long gone, they say now. Burned, buried, forgotten, but plates still clatter in the dark, and somewhere a silver lid rises, waiting for eyes to meet what lies beneath. The table is long gone, yet plates still clatter in the dark, and somewhere a silver lid rises, waiting for eyes to meet what lies beneath. The manor is no more. Its walls, once dripping with secrets and sweat, were torn down plank by plank, the cypress roots clawing through what foundations remained. Where men had dined, where chains had rung, there is only earth now, raw, uneven, pocked with stones that refuse to be dislodged. The locals plough around it, their mules balking when the iron blades scrape against something that does not sound like stone. No crop grows where the dining hall once stood. The soil there is blackened, not with ash, but with something darker, as though blood itself had sunk deep into the marrow of the ground and would never wash clean. And yet at night the earth remembers. They say when the wind stills, when cicadas fall mute, when the swamp draws in its breath, one can hear the sounds that should not remain, plates striking porcelain, goblets knocking wood, silver clinking against silver. The rhythm of a supper long finished, but never digested by time. The sound does not scatter like ordinary noise. It circles. It lingers. It tightens around the listener's head until they cannot tell if it is within the air or within the skull itself. Some have sworn that the table, though gone, can still be found. They speak of wandering into the ruined grove by moonlight, where the outlines of chairs flicker like pale bones, half risen from the soil. They claim that if one dares to step closer, a shape takes form, the frame of a long oaken table etched not in wood but in shadow. Candles gutter along its length, flames bending away from the center as though repelled. The plates gleam white, though no hand sets them, and a silver lid waits at the far end, its edges fogged with breath that no living lungs could give. Don't lift it, the elders whisper. Never lift the lid. But every tale ends the same. Some fool, too brave or too curious, extends a hand. The silver cover is cold, heavy, almost reluctant to move until it does. And beneath there is always a face. Sometimes it is the master's, eyes open wide, lips parted in a soundless curse. Sometimes it is one's own reflection, pale and rotting, the flesh sinking away as though one were staring decades into the grave. And sometimes, most terrible of all, it is not one face but many pressed together cheek to cheek, as though they had all been served upon the same plate. The air curdles when the lid rises. The scent of rust, of iron, of wet soil grips the nostrils. Those who see it never speak clearly afterward. Their voices stutter, their eyes dart, their hands twitch as though some invisible cutlery scrapes constantly at their bones. One man was found clawing at his throat, trying to pull something out that was never there. Another swore that each time he sat to supper in his own home, he heard a whisper, "Not fed, not fed." The curse is not bound to the house, it follows the ritual. Wherever men feast with cruelty still burning in the land, wherever bread is broken without justice, the echo of that tray is said to appear. In Charleston, an entire plantation family fell ill after supper, their tongues swelling until they could no longer draw breath. In Savannah, a merchant was seen screaming at an empty table, his hands slapping away invisible dishes. In New Orleans, a preacher claimed to hear plates clatter in his church at night, though no meal had been set, and always the stories returned to the lid. They say the servant who lifted it that first time, the woman with silent eyes, does not rest. Her shadow lingers, not in one place but wherever the supper replays. Some describe her standing at the head of the table, her hands still steady, her silence more thunderous than any scream. Others say she waits behind the onlooker, her breath brushing their ear as the lid rises, as though reminding them, this is not just his feast, it is yours. Children are warned away from the old soil, but still they wander. Some return pale, mute, unable to eat again. Others never return at all. Dogs will not cross the grove. Horses shy and bolt. Even the crows, who once lined the iron gates for nights without rest, keep their distance now, circling wide but never daring to land. Yet the supper continues. The sounds will not fade. On certain nights when the moon sits swollen and red, those who live nearby swear the clatter grows so loud it can be heard in every room of their homes. Dishes strike, knives scrape, goblets topple. It builds into a frenzy, louder and louder, until it ends with one final deafening silence. And in that silence every listener feels it, the rising of the silver lid, the weight of unseen eyes meeting their own, and somewhere in the dark, though the house is gone and the table rotted, the feast begins again. The earth has swallowed the manna, but the meal was never finished, and until it is, the plates will never stop clattering.